然后我是台全会的宜家，然后我在台全会是做就是台湾人权促进会，然后我在台全会是做居住跟土地议题，然后今天很开心可以跟 Ours 还有崔妈妈就是一起合办这个讲座。那我们今天这个讲座的主题是关于这个租屋者的居住权能够怎么样的被保障。那其实居住是人权嘛，那无论其实居住的形态是哪一种，都是要让人可以住得安心，然后让我们可以成为更好的自己的一个样子。那我们今天的这个讲座主题呢，是从就是租屋的这个类型开始谈起。那今天很特别的是呢，我们要从这个美国的经验来谈这个租屋者居住权的主题。那我们要从美国南部墨西哥湾旁边的纽奥良谈起。那也希望就是纽奥良的经验呢，可以来刺激我们思考这个台湾租屋的现况，然后跟我们能够怎么样改善就是目前的情况。那想要给大家一点点背景，我不会说非常的多，但因为比较主要会请讲者来说明。就纽奥良，它其实是一个租户的城市，有接近一半的市民，它其实都是租房子住。那同时呢，纽奥良所在的路易斯安那州，又是在美国对于这个租户保障是一个倒数的一个州。那这样子在最极端的这个情况之下呢，租客其实是在10天之内就可以经过法院驱离的程序。那当然这件事情它也跟这个社会历史的过程有关，那它同时也是镶嵌在种族跟阶级不平等的社会情况之中。那我今天想要很简单的介绍一下我们的讲者。我们的讲者是就是美国纽奥良 Jeff Place 的社区组织部的主任。那Frank 会来跟我们分享，就是他在美国怎么样争取租户权利的这个经验。那我同时也想要介绍我们今天的口译泰和，然后因为我们今天讲者会用英文嘛，那我们翻译的方式会是讲者讲一段，然后我们翻译一段。那我们今天的这个讲座可以顺利的进行，都要非常感谢就是泰和的协助。那就把时间交给就是两位。
Hello. Here we go. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yassine Frank Safal. Most folks just call me Frank, my middle name. And I am the Organizing Communication Manager at the Jane Place Neighborhood Sustainable Initiative in New Orleans, Louisiana, which is, if you're not familiar with American geography, Louisiana is on the Gulf of Mexico, right next to Texas. And it's basically where the Mississippi River ends, one of the largest rivers in Western Missouri.
好，大家午安。他的名字呢叫做 Yassine Frank Safal。那基本上大多数人都叫他中间的那个名字 Frank。那他是 Jane Place Neighborhood Sustainability Initiative 邻里永续倡议的这个社区组织部的主任。那这个地方呢，它其实是在路易斯安那的纽奥良这个地方。那如果大家熟悉美国的地理的话呢，路易斯安那呢，基本上就在墨西哥湾那边靠近德州的地方。那它也基本上也是美国非常大的一条河——密西西比河结束的地方。
There we go. So about me. So I'm 40 years old. I've worked in the field of housing organizing for about 11 years. I got my start in interest in housing organizing when I was one of the co-founders of the Occupy Oakland General Assembly back in 2011. So this is a younger me right there in the purple jacket, facilitating meeting. Oakland, California is a very interesting place in terms of housing.
那稍微介绍一下他自己，他现在今年是40岁。那其实，在投入住房啊、组织相关的这些活动已经11年的时间。一开始呢是在2011年的时候，在加州奥克良这边呢也组织了一个算是一个住房的这个大会。那这边算是他比较年轻的时候的他，那时候穿着紫色的这个外套。那稍微跟大家介绍一下，其实加州奥克兰它的这个住房状况其实蛮有趣的。
And they got involved in housing in part because of what we call in the U.S. a Great Recession from 2007 to 2011. There was a massive slowdown in the American economy, and lots of people lost their homes lots of people were evicted. And at the time when I was living in Oakland, California, it was a center of people losing their homes. And so people fought back, they organized homeowners losing their homes, they organized renters, and they organized homeless people to squat buildings and basically take back big-owned buildings so that people had places to live. And that was the spark that motivated me to do this work.
那其实当时呢，如果大家记得的话，在07年到2011年的时候，那时候美国是经济大衰退的时候，也因此很多人失去了他们自己的房子，那甚至呢，如果是租户，然后被迫被迁徙迫迁，那所以非常多人，尤其是在奥克兰这个地方，是非常多人都流离失所。那许多原本是房子持有者的人，因此失去了自己的房子，所以后来这一群流离失所的人呢，他们就聚集了所有，不管是失去房子的人，还是无家可归的人，还是这些租户呢，就去霸占这些后来被银行所持有的房子。所以他们就去霸占这些建筑，然后开始做一些相关的规划跟计划。那也是在这个时候呢，他开始对于这样的一个活动非常有兴趣的，因此有所参与。
And so what is Jane Place? We were founded 3 years after Hurricane Katrina in 2008 due to a lot of developers moving into New Orleans and taking over lots of land and housing. And we are basically a community land trust and housing rights organization. I'll explain what a community land trust is in a little bit. But I'll just read off our mission. You have this in Chinese?
Yes.
Okay. Our mission is to transfer unjust housing policy, discriminatory practices, and inequitable development schemes by engaging strategies that create permanently affordable housing, advance tenant rights, expand housing security, and uphold equitable housing patterns and land use planning.
好，那其实再跟大家介绍一下到底什么是 Jane Place。Jane Place 呢，其实是在卡翠娜飓风2008年侵袭纽奥良地区之后3年后成立的。那其实3年后的时候，那时候的背景是说，当时呢，因为其实卡翠娜飓风其实造成非常大的影响，那时候就开始有很多的开发商进驻，然后开始占有了很多的土地，然后开始新建很多的房子。那所以 Jane House 呢，Jane Place 呢，主要就是在做的是社区的这种土地信托。那等一下也会跟大家介绍一下什么是土地信托制。那稍微讲一下，我们直接念一下它的使命。他们的使命基本上就是透过参与政策的制定，打造永久可以负担的住房，促进租户的权利，扩大住房的保障，跟维护公平的住房模式跟土地使用的规划，去改变不公正的住房政策、歧视性的做法跟不公平的发展计划。
And so, very importantly, by housing security and permanently affordable housing, we mean that if working class and impoverished people live in a dwelling that the government is putting money into, they should be able to age share from 1 year or so until they are elder. People shouldn't be evicted from affordable housing ever, in our opinion.
好，所以我们讲到住房安全跟永远可负担的住房的意思，就是说，既然这些工作阶级的人，既然这些比较贫穷的人住在的是政府补助的这些住房社会住宅里面的话，那这样的话代表是说，每年他们应该都可以继续非常安全的住下去，从他住进的第1年到最后他的老年，最后他在整个过程中都不应该被驱逐，不应该被迫迁。
There we go. Wait, no. I'm so bad at this. Okay, there we go. So we basically have 3 segments of work. And I'll talk about each one briefly before we get on to talk more about renters' rights and tenants' rights. And the first one is we're founded to build affordable housing. And so when we need a permanently affordable housing in our community land trust, the community land trust model is a tool where you preserve housing controlled by the people. Meaning the people who live in our housing are on our board of directors. They influence the development patterns we utilize to build more housing. What type of housing? What type of fundraising we do. So the people who are most impacted live in our property the most.
好，那基本上呢，我们使用要达到这些刚刚讲到的这个使命的目的的方式呢，有3种方式。那我稍微简单的介绍一下这3种方式，之后才会跟大家谈一下住户大会。 那主要有3种方式，是第一个就是透过刚刚讲到怎么打造永久可以负担的住房呢？我们透过的是社区土地信托这个制度。这个制度其实算是一个工具吧，也就是说，我们基本上是保存说这些住在我们这个房产这些人呢，他们变成了有点像是我们的董事会的成员。那基本上由他们可以去决定说我们要怎么样去打造，或者是要盖什么样的类别的这个房子，然后去做一些资金的筹募。
And so one thing I want to explain too, we are funded by numerous ways. Partially, we get a lot of money from the central government in the U.S., the federal government. But increasingly, we're trying to switch to figure out ways to develop housing on our own, because in the USA, there are a lot of bureaucratic, trying to use American red tape, a lot of bureaucratic things when it comes to housing development. So we are reaching out to friends who have money, who can loan us money, 0 interest, so we can develop housing. One of the houses we're doing that is Miss Ella's house, who she's an elder who passed away about 18 months ago. And her children sold us her house at a very affordable rate because we agreed to keep it affordable. And by keeping it affordable, as well as not using federal dollars, we can have anyone we want to live in the property. Because in USA, if you are not a permanent resident or a citizen, you cannot live in any building that has any federal dollars, which means we discriminate against a lot of our brothers and sisters from Latin America who don't have the necessary paperwork. So the same way that Taiwan has a migrant crisis, in USA, we have some horrible immigration laws. So we want to ensure that anyone can live in our houses, and in particular, the neighborhood we build in is filled with a lot of immigrants from Latin America and also Vietnam. So we want to protect those families. So in the future, our houses will be built without federal tax dollars.
好，那稍微跟大家讲一下，其实我们基本上的资金来源呢是有几类的。第一个呢是中央联邦政府这边提供的一些补助，第二个呢是我们越来越希望倾向未来能够多做的，就是我们是自己拿到自己的钱，然后自己进行开发房子。那主要原因是因为其实如果是拿中央政府的钱的话，其实美国这种一定会有一些官僚的制度，然后一定会有一些很多的限制，所以我们呢可能后来决定要用的方式就是，譬如说可能有一些朋友相对来说是比较有钱的，那他们可能愿意借我们钱，然后是用零利率的方式。那或者像是譬如说右边这边你可以看到，这是 Miss Ella。Miss Ella 呢，她大概是18个月前过世的。那她的小孩呢，就把这个房子卖给了我们，是用非常低合宜的价格卖给了我们。因为我们答应他们说，我们会后来建成这个房子呢，我们继续租给的一定是保证它是永久可合宜的这个价格，永久可负担的这个价格。那因为我们不需要又拿联邦政府的钱，所以呢，我们这样的房子呢可以租给的是任何人。因为在美国，如果你是拿联邦政府的钱的话，只要有这政府的钱进去的话，能够租的人一定是这边的永久居民，或者是有永久居留证的人。也就是说，他因此排挤了非常多的移民。再有刚好我们在这个地方纽奥良地区呢，有很多拉丁裔或者是越南裔的这些家户移民，其实都因此没有办法住在联邦政府补助的这些住房里面。那其实跟台湾的这些移民的状况其实是非常像，在美国是有非常多歧视性的移民的法律，也因此他们没有办法租到房子。那如果我们没有拿联邦的这个税款的话呢，基本上就代表是我们在开发房产上面跟选择租客上面就可以相对比较自由。
And so this is the second bucket of work we do, advocacy. And our advocacy work encompasses doing policy work, working to change government policies, and also conducting research, what we call in the US community-based participatory research, which means basically the community is involved in deciding what type of research to do. Sometimes they're involved in collecting the research, and oftentimes they're often involved in creating the questions. So whether, not to get deep in research world, but basically they're involved in all different aspects. As well as our advocacy, we also do tenants' rights education, where basically we want to educate tenants about what their rights are, because the state of Louisiana is very different than other American states you may know, such as New York and California. In Louisiana, as Icha mentioned earlier, it can take 10 days for a tenant to be evicted. Whereas in California, you can delay eviction by 3 months, which gives people a lot more time to plan, especially people with family and children. But really, I'll just quickly read overall what we say our advocacy is all about. Our advocacy centers the voices and needs of residents most vulnerable to housing insecurity, discrimination, and displacement. We work in partnership with tenants and community members to create collective and collaborative solutions that serve to strengthen neighborhoods and families, change policies, and build partnerships.
好，那再来呢？除了刚刚介绍的话呢，我们也会做的是倡议。那倡议其实也包括的是一些政策上的倡议，然后怎么样去试着改变政府的政策啊，以及我们会做一些研究。那简单介绍一下研究，我们所谓的研究其实是以社区为基础的这种参与式的研究。这基本上意思就是在整个研究的过程中，社区是投入的，由社区去决定说他们想要什么类型的研究。有时候他们也会参与收集相关的研究，跟他们去发展出他们想要提问的一些问题。那我就先不太深入的介绍这个研究，但基本上这研究包含的是非常多不同的一些面向。那除此之外呢，我们也会做的是租户权利的教育，基本上就去告诉他们说他们到底享有什么样的权利。就像宜家刚刚提到的是，其实路易斯安那这个地方呢，其实跟其他纽约啊、加州这些地方很不太一样。就是路易斯安那这个地方，如果你被驱逐了，如果你被迫迁，收到这个通知了以后呢，你10天内就必须要搬走。但是在加州呢，相对来说，你可以把它延后到3个月的时间。这代表的是说，这些被驱逐的租客基本上就会有比较多的时间可以去做规划，尤其是如果你有家人、有小孩的话，你可能要花比较多的时间安排。
And so, basic the core of the presentation, our third bucket of work is organizing community engagement. We use multiple strategies to engage the community regarding housing issues. We conduct public education, meaning tenants' rights education, but also other housing issues that people are facing. We conduct outreach, host community events, and do tenant organizing, bringing the most vulnerable renters or working class homeowners together to take action against evictions, displacement, and gentrification.
好，那第三个呢，我们在做的呢，刚刚讲到总共3大块嘛。第3大块呢，我们就是组织跟社区的一个互动跟参与，所以我们会使用很多种不同的策略，让社区可以去参与，一起解决住房的问题。我们可以进行公共的教育，公共教育可能就包括我刚刚提到的租户权利的教育，或者是一些其他的住房的议题。那还有一些联络向外展的一些活动。举办社区的活动，组织租客，让弱势的租客跟工人阶级的这些屋主能够聚集在一起，一起采取行动，反对驱逐、迫迁、流离失所跟计生化。
And as a part of that work, one of the organizations we help birth, a semi-autonomous group, is the New Orleans Renters' Rights Assembly, which I'll explain a little bit about. The New Orleans Renters' Rights Assembly is a semi-independent group of renters, homeless individuals, and working class homeowners who are fighting for more housing rights. They basically use multiple methods to do what they want, what they believe in, whether it is organizing in apartment buildings owned by abusive landlords, pursuing policy campaigns to change landlord-tenant law, or just doing education drives. So we work hand in hand with the Renters' Rights Assembly, and just want to pass around a couple photographs that can show you some of the things the Renters' Rights Assembly's done and that we've done as Jane Place in conjunction with the Renters' Rights Assembly. Sorry.
好，那再来稍微跟大家介绍一下，那之后因为这个租户的权利呢相关，所以后来发展出的一个组织，就算是一个半自主型的组织，叫做 Renters' Rights Assembly， 就是租客权利大会或者租户大会。它基本上算是一个半独立的一个组织，然后聚集呢是各个不同的租客、租户，然后工人阶级的家户持有者，或者是无家可归无家者，一起呢去捍卫他们自己的住房权，或者是争取相关的住房权。他们用各种不同的方式呢去推动、去促进他们相信的一些理念。 所以，譬如说，有好几种不同的方式，譬如说，可能，这个房东是非常恶质的房东，那他们就可能在这个恶质房东拥有的这个大楼里面，他们组织起来，或者是他们透过是政策的倡议，或者是彼此教育说，身为租客，我们的权利有哪一些？所以等一下就给大家传阅一些照片，来看看说租户大会呢，做了一些什么事情，以及 Jam Place 呢跟租户大会一起合作做了一些什么事情。
And so this building, the organizing event or protest moment, the birth of the New Orleans Renters' Strike Assembly was a couple of tenants lived in this building called the American Can Building, which is an old warehouse that was renovated with federal funds. And it's a long explanation as to American housing finance. I can talk one-on-one and maybe answer that question later, but it's a long, crazy explanation. But anyway, so these tenants were living in this building and they were getting ready to be kicked out. And so there was no renters' rights organization in New Orleans or state of Louisiana, or really even in the deep south in the 4 states around Louisiana that they could contact. So they came to Jane Place because they knew we were a bunch of weirdo radicals, and basically we decided to help them. And so we organized with them and we were able to get them more months to live there. We forced the landlord to pay many of the tenants money to move, which is something that happens in other parts of the United States when tenants organize, but doesn't ever happen in the American South. So in that moment, many of the tenants on here who were protesting with like, hey, we need to found and create an explicit renters' rights group. So the photographs I'm missing around are some of the pre-pandemic moments of both the Renters' Rights Assembly and also Jane Place doing tenant organizing.
好，那其实他们在做这些组织啊，在做抗议的时候呢，其实一开始的时候会有租户大会的成立的是在一个murky what's the building say?
Can building?
Yeah.
It's a can factory.
OK， 好，那基本上呢，它是原本那栋大楼的这些租户呢要被迫迁的，但那栋大楼呢原本是一个算是罐头工厂，然后改装成一个就是变成一个租客给租客提供租客的这种住户的大楼，那它是由联邦政府去补助的。那其实如果等一下有时间的话，我可以回答说，就是联邦住房的一些相关的这些资金来源这个非常复杂的问题，在美国它其实也是蛮疯狂的一件事情。但基本上呢，这些租户呢要被迫迁，然后也被迫必须要搬走。那其实他们也试着努力，但是在美国这种包括路易斯安那跟其他这种非常极南方的这些4个州里面的，其实基本上都没有相关的办法，他们就不知道求助无援。最后他们就找到了 Jam Place， 觉得说他们是一群怪咖，然后又是非常极端的分子，应该可以帮助他们吧。所以呢，就找到了这个组织。那 Jam Place 也决定帮助他们，那也因此最后造成的结果是，他们终于可以在这个地方至少能够多住个几个月的时间。同时呢，房东必须要付钱给他们，让这些租户搬走。所以在美国其他地方，其实确实有组织起来的这些租客是房东是有案例是房东付钱让这些租客搬走的，但是呢，在美国南方其实从来没有这样的方式，所以第一次终于在这样美国南方的州里面有一个这样的一个情况，有第一个首例出现的。那他们也觉得说，那他们要继续持续透过抗议，他们必须要有相关租户权利的这种团体建立起来。那刚刚给大家看这些照片，传阅的照片呢是疫情前 Jam Place 跟租户大会他们做的一些活动，抗议活动。
And so when the pandemic happened, we had to shift tactics. It was pretty young in the Renters' Rights Assembly's history. The Renters' Rights Assembly was birthed in the spring of 2018, but really we didn't start meeting into the fall of 2018. And that's when I was hired at Jane Place. We didn't really have independent work into January 2020, which, as we all know, was around 2 months before the whole globe went on lockdown. So these photographs show some of the things we did very early on in the pandemic.
好，那因为在那疫情之后呢，我们就必须要去改变一下我们的策略了。当时其实租户大会他们才成立没有太多的时间，2018年春天的时候才成立的租户大会，那一直到秋天的时候才开始有比较具体的讨论。那也是在差不多这个时候呢，就是 Frank Bay 就是进入到这个 Jam Place 工作。那到了2020年的1月的时候呢，他们还开始有比较定期的活动，但是大家都知道2个月之后，基本上疫情就这样爆发了。所以接下来给大家看到的是，就是稍微疫情初期的时候他们做的一些活动。
But really quickly, I want to backtrack a little bit, just to explain a little bit about the history of Louisiana to give you a cultural context. The U.S. is confusing even to me as an American. While we are the same country, ultimately many of the laws are determined on a central state or province level. So in some places, for example, immigrants can have access to housing because the state funds it. Reproductive health rights are normal. Women have the access to abortion. Trans and queer people are not very fearful of the laws the government creates. Whereas some other places, you can have laws of really reactionary, scary, authoritarian type places. And so Louisiana is one of those places. We rank generally 49th or 50th last in the US on most social measures, whether it's education, healthcare, reproductive health, and then landlord-tenant laws, which we're here to talk about today, we rank last.
好，那稍微跟大家我们回过头稍微介绍一下路易斯安那的一些背景。其实大家可能会觉得说美国是同一个国家，但虽然是同一个国家，其实所有的一些法律的一些立法呢，基本上都是在州甚至往下郡的一个阶级。所以可以看到的是，也许有一些州它确实移民是有一些保障的，是可以住房子的，然后是有国家去这些州政府会出资的。那也许有些地方确实生育相关来说，他们是受到保障的，女性是可以堕胎的。那也许有些地方他们可能跨性或是酷儿呢，他们不会害怕相关的法律的一些规范，没有歧视的一些做法。但是呢，在有些州呢，确实对于这一些族群来说的话，相关的法律是非常糟糕且非常不理性的。那路易斯安那就是其中一州。那路易斯安那不管在社会的一些相关措施、福利措施上面，不管是教育、健保、生育，还是我们今天要谈到的这种房东跟租户的这些权利来讲的话呢，它在50个州里面排名第49。
And so, to give context to about the history, of course, in the USA, it was occupied or indigenous people, tribes similar to indigenous people of Taiwan, lived there. So New Orleans originally was called Babuncha, which in the Choctaw language, a tribe in Louisiana and Mississippi, means land of many tongues. So New Orleans is a very fascinating place in that it was always a place of diversity. It was a convergence of many different tribes who came all the way from central parts of Mexico to parts midway in the North American continent to other parts of South to trade. And then of course the French and Spanish colonized the area. That's Napoleon, if you know anything about French history. It's Napoleon ultimately is the reason why New Orleans is controlled by the USA and not France, or it's not its own independent country, because he was too ambitious, and so he sold Louisiana to the USA. So it's a very important thing to understand that the culture of Louisiana, up until 100 years ago, many people spoke French, for example, in Spanish as well. But when you think about why is this important, is the French and Spanish came there because of the fertile land. The environment is very similar to Taiwan, though Taiwan is a lot more humid. And basically they wanted to grow tobacco, cotton, sugarcane, and other items that Europeans wanted because they couldn't get it from Asia. They couldn't subjugate people in other parts of the world, and they couldn't do it in Africa because while they were able to steal people from Africa, it took a little bit longer for them to actually colonize Africa. So they colonized the Americas, because people in the Western Hemisphere didn't have the weapons and technology that people had in the Eastern Hemisphere, in Europe and Africa and Asia. So just give that really quick context as to why that happened. And so of course as part of that, they went to Africa because Africa was the easiest place for them to steal people. And someone asked me, why didn't they enslave indigenous people like the Spaniards did in Mexico? It's because they killed them very early on. And also diseases wiped out people in North America, the indigenous people, much quicker. So that's one of the reasons why, compared to Mexico, for example, on a sociological, demographical level, Mexico looks very different than the US. Just to give that quick context. Someone asked me about that.
好，那稍微回到一下，就是刚刚路易斯安那的这个历史呢，基本上呢，就是一开始的时候，美国基本上就是一个被殖民占据的一个地方嘛。那一开始的时候，当然一开始路易斯安那是就像其实台湾一样，是原住民族住在这边，还有很多不同的部落。那我们那边的部落叫做Boncha， 基本上就是有很多类型的很多人不同的民族住在这个土地。那是一个非常多样化的地方，很多的不同的部落都住在这边，就从中墨西哥到一路到是不同的原住民族，全部这一块是个非常丰富的一个地方。但是后来呢，它就被先被法国殖民统治，然后再被西班牙，然后之后又转手法国。那给大家看这张图呢，是这一张图，如果大家熟悉法国历史的话，这个是拿破仑。那拿破仑也是为什么之后为什么路易斯安那其实后来并不是法国所持有，而是卖给了美国的原因，因为他非常有野心，所以他后来呢就把路易斯安那卖给了美国。那稍微让大家了解一下路易斯安那的文化，所以其实因为这么长一段时间的一个殖民的历史，在这200年前以前呢，其实非常多住在那边的人其实是会说法语跟西班牙文的。那可是呢，为什么这一块这么重要呢？因为当初法国跟西班牙之所以看上路易斯安那的时候，是因为它是一个非常丰饶的一块土地，它的环境其实跟台湾有点类似，但是台湾其实潮湿的多，但基本上呢，法国跟西班牙他们来到路易斯安那的时候呢，是希望能够种植烟草，能够种植蔗糖、棉花，基本上就是这些欧洲想要，但是他没有办法去亚洲拿，那他也没有办法去其他地方拿，他也没有办法去非洲拿的地方。他们在非洲可以偷了很多的人，但是呢，那时候他们没有办法那么快的去殖民统治非洲，所以他们先能够殖民统治的就是美国这块地方，因为当时美国这些原住民族，他们其实并没有。就是像那时候的东半球或者是欧洲还有亚洲这些地方拥有的一些武器跟相关的科技，那所以对他们来说最简单的方式就是去非洲偷人，然后去占领美洲。那大家可能之前有人问他说，那为什么他们不直接使用就是当时就是直接让这些一开始就在这边的原住民成为他们的奴隶就好了呢？因为一开始的时候他们几乎把大多数人都杀光了。那也因为疾病传染的关系，有许多人也因此死亡了。所以在北美这一块的地方的时候，实在没有人可以用，他们就直接去非洲去偷人。这也是为什么相对来说的话，在这个背景来讲的话，它跟墨西哥然后跟美国这一块是不太一样的。
And so to also remind you again, but also show you some photographs that birthed the organization of Jane Place that then created the Render Strike Assembly. So, as I mentioned earlier, Hurricane Katrina came in, devastated New Orleans. Many corporations and private developers from around the world came and brought land. If you're not familiar with New Orleans is a major center of tourism in the Western Hemisphere. So the way that people go to, say, Tokyo, like, around the globe, people come to New Orleans from around the Western Hemisphere. In particular, a lot of Europeans come there as well, and people from Latin America.
好，那再来就是这边稍微再重新给大家回顾一下，就是一开始的时候呢是卡翠娜飓风之后呢有 Jane Place， 那在那之后呢又有了租户大会。那其实因为卡翠娜飓风当时袭击美国的时候呢，其实因为让纽奥良这块地方其实受灾非常的严重，所以因此他后来有非常多的公司啊跟私人的这些开发人啊，就是来自全世界的这种公司跟私人开发商呢，就因此到纽奥良这一块地方买了很多的土地，然后进行相关的开发。 那纽奥良这一块的地方呢，它基本上算是西半球的一个观光的一个重地。讲西半球观光重地的意思就是说，譬如说像我们可能很喜欢去东京嘛，那其实对于这些西半球也是欧洲人这些人来说的话，他们最喜欢去的地方就是纽奥良。
And so these photos are really the core birth of what birthed Jane Place. And basically what happened after Hurricane Katrina, the local government realized they could tear down our social housing, which social housing in the US, we were one of the first countries to build modern social housing back in the 30s. And basically as a way to get rid of poor working class people in New Orleans, even though the buildings that social housing were in were good brick buildings that didn't get washed away with Katrina, the government wanted to get rid of poor people, so they decided to tear down the 4 biggest social housing neighborhoods, which amounted to upwards of 40,000 people. And so these are photographs from a riot because of people trying to get into our city hall building. And no one goes to our city meetings in New Orleans because they're very boring. Just some government's boring everywhere, you know. But they're really boring. But thousands of people showed up. Both people lived in the buildings and then advocates and activists, NGOs, to stop this from happening. And so this is a police officer fighting an older lady right there. And this is photos of basically the city tearing down the social housing. Why was this important? 3 years after a storm, the US government was very slow to repair New Orleans, in part because it was a Republican administration at the time. George W. Bush, the one who invaded Iraq, he really didn't care about Louisiana. And so they didn't allocate the proper funding really to repair all of the city until after Obama came in office. And so basically what happened is that the city government was able to do social engineering to get rid of the poorest of the poor. And so Jane Place was birthed by activists who were like, enough is enough. We need to build affordable housing and control on our own terms with the community. That way the government can't step in. And unlike Taiwan, the US doesn't have strict sort of eminent domain policies. It's actually really hard at times to do eminent domain if people fight back. Zonal expropriation.
好，那再来是就是基本上呢，大概主要一开始这2个组织出来的原因就是如此。那你可以看到的是，其实在卡翠娜飓风之后呢，其实当地政府发现说这其实是很好很简单的方式，我们把这些社会住宅全部都打掉好了。所以1930年代的时候呢，路易斯安那算是非常早期，就是开始盖了一些社会住宅，让一些比较穷苦的人，然后比较工作阶级的人呢，工人阶级的人呢，可以在那边居住。那你会政府呢就发现说这是非常好的方式啊，那就把这些非常可以赶走这些穷苦的这些人，把这些穷人全部把他赶走，不要让他们住在这边。所以就算有些社会住宅，其实在卡翠娜飓风之后呢，它还是状况非常好，它也是专制的，然后没有因此被卡翠娜飓风影响。但是呢，政府还是决定就可以把它拆掉了。所以可以看到的是，目前这一块就是政府后来决定拆掉，就是4大块，就是社会住宅的这个邻里，所以受到影响，因此流离失所人超过4万人。那所以上面看到就是因此造成的一个暴动，就是大家全部都冲到市政府里面。大家都知道，其实是全世界的政府都是一样无聊的。可是呢，在这个活动里面，就是大家数千人呢，其实包括受到影响的这些房子被拆的这些人呢，或者是一些倡议分子啊、NGO 啊、行动者等等，就冲到了市政府这边呢，那希望能够就是阻止市政府做出这样的一个决议。所以因此你可以看到这个是警方跟一个比较年长的一个女性在打架。那所以这也是为什么所以这整个背景就是在飓风的3年，就是卡翠娜飓风3年之后呢，整个路易斯安那纽奥良地区呢，它的整个修复复原的情况是非常非常慢。那时候呢，其实是共和党政府，那就是George W. Bush， 他那时候基本上就是他去侵犯伊拉克嘛。那他们整个基本上就是共和党政府呢，执政党他们其实不在乎的是我们路易斯安那地区跟纽奥良地区。 所以它整个修复的过程就是非常的慢。其实一直是到奥巴马上任之后呢，才开始慢慢进行修复的。那整个政府，市政府呢，当时就是借这个机会在做这个社会工程，也就是直接把这些穷人就直接赶走，让他们没有办法住在这个地方。那也因此呢，会有 Jam Place， 它集合了各种的倡议人士，觉得说我们受够了，不应该再继续这样做了，所以是由我们自己来发展出这些可负担的房子，让这个社区能够，让大家都能够使用。其实，纽奥良跟就是美国呢，跟台湾不太一样的地方是我们没有这个土地征收的这个制度，基本上是比较困难的。也就是说，如果社区反对的话呢，基本上就不太能够进行这种强制的土地征收。
And so again, going back to how we're founded, or how the Renters' Rights Assembly, the New Orleans Renters' Rights Assembly, was founded. In June 2017, like I mentioned, the people in the American Can building were facing a mass eviction, and they contacted Jane Place because they knew Jane Place was a bunch of young activists who didn't care about what the government or anyone thought, and so they knew Jane Place was willing to help them in organizing. And so they were able to fight against the displacement, get people rehoused, force the owner of the building to pay them out money, extend the lease for some of the tenants who want to stay. And then also, I forgot, they also got the landlord to find new affordable housing for the people, which is pretty rare anywhere in our country, but definitely does happen in Louisiana. So they organized, fought back against displacement. So like I mentioned, in spring of 2018, they formed the Renters' Rights Assembly. And so again, these are the tenants from the American Can building. But this is the logo of the New Orleans Renters' Rights Assembly. As you can tell, it's a fist. I'm not sure, is a fist really? Is it, you guys use fists?
Yes.
Okay, so that cultural context makes sense. But what a lot of people don't know is this is a key. And so basically, as you can put together, it's ideal that people should have access to housing by any means necessary, whether it's through lobbying, policy, or direct action. So whether it's squatting, whether it's educating tenants about their rights so legally to fight back, by any means necessary, people should be able to hold them to their housing. And so that is why we have the fist coming out of the key.
好，那再来跟大家讲的是说，那个纽奥良的租户大会是怎么样去成立的？其实跟大家刚刚分享的是一样，在2017年6月的时候呢，其实就是有一个公寓的人，他们被迫就是这些人要大规模的被出租，大规模的被迫迁。所以这些租户呢，知道说哦 ，Jam Place 是一群非常年轻的行动者，那他们不在乎政府啊或者其他人到底的想法，所以他们就联络了我们，就觉得说应该他们会愿意我们会愿意帮他们吧。所以确实呢，他就希望我们能够帮他们协助去组织，然后能够进行一些抗议。那他们就组织起来了，一起去抗议，去反对流离失所。那刚刚也有提到，他们是2018年春季的时候呢，一起成立的。那也因此成功了，他们成功的让愿意留下来的人，想要继续住下来的人，他们的租约延长了，能够让房东真的付钱给其他人呢，让他们去搬到其他的地方，甚至他们让房东呢愿意。就让房东必须要帮这些要搬走的人找到新的可负担的这些住房。那其实这就算在美国也是非常常见的，非常罕见的。那更不忘说是在路易斯安那，这是从来没有见过的。那所以呢，在2018年春季的时候呢，就成立了这个租户大会。那大家可以看到是他参加了一些抗议，跟下面的这个是他们的这个logo， 可以看到的是。上面是一个拳头，然后下面这整个形状呢，其实是一个钥匙的形状，所以它基本上的概念就是说呢，大家呢是应该可以用各个需要的方式的都能够获得拥有的住房，所以不管是这个方式是透过的是游说，透过政策倡议，甚至透过直接的行动，也就是直接占领房子啊，或者是教育租户这些相关的权利，可以透过各种必要的方式，总之大家是应该可以享有住房的。
And so these are more photographs of early Renters' Rights Assembly things. This is a protest against gentrification and vacation rentals. This is actually my roommate Susan right there with the bullhorn. And as you can see, this is the logo. So the logo for the Renters' Rights Assembly was birthed on these fists and key signs that were created by actually Tony Jones, who Tony is the sister of one of my co-workers, Thackeray Jones. And she's a brilliant activist organizing trans woman who's doing amazing work in Louisiana, in the American South, fighting against the right-wing, trying to destroy trans and queer people in Louisiana. And so she's also a brilliant artist, and so she came up with the ideal of the hand and key ideal, which when we heard her describe it, we were like, oh, so brilliant. And she always wants me to tell people that everyone should use her thing, not because she's egotistical, but mainly because she thinks it's a really good symbol of tenant and working class power. Oh, and this is a protest just against all short-term rentals in New Orleans, which short-term rentals are Airbnb, which in New Orleans there's tens of thousands of them that eat up working class housing.
好，那再来呢，给大家看到的是一些我们可能上街抗议的一些画面，包括是左边是反对是这个整个街区被晋升化，以及你可以看到是在这个抗议的同时呢，也有一样是有我们这个 logo 住户大会的一个 logo， 就是钥匙呢跟拳头。那这个其实是由右边这个女士，就是 Tony Jones 她创造的这个 logo。那她其实是个跨性别的女性，她一直非常努力在致力反对在路易斯安那这些右翼，然后他们去打压酷儿跟跨性的一些权利，那所以他是一个非常棒的一个艺术家。那他跟我们分享说，那时候有一个这个拳头啊跟这个钥匙的这个概念的时候，我们都觉得这真是太棒了。那他也非常鼓励我们，就是持续去使用这一个logo， 因为这样的话就可以持续的去跟大家讲说，我们在怎么去捍卫这些租户跟工人阶级这些人他们的住房的这些权利。那右边这一个呢，这个抗议的是各种短期的这种租房，也就是说 Airbnb 啦。因为在纽奥良地区呢，其实有好数万户的这种 Airbnb， 那它当然打压到就是长期租房这种工人阶级租房的这个市场。
And so when the pandemic hit the USA, depending on what part of the USA you're in, some places they had a month of lockdown. In some parts of the country, it was a little bit more, and the social attitudes meant that the lockdown was very similar to how it was in parts of Asia and Europe and South America and Africa. But early in Louisiana, because we are very capitalist, they decided to open bars beginning in May 2020. And what that meant is because our economy in Louisiana is very heavily tourist-based, meaning if you come to New Orleans, you can drink 24 hours a day, go to a bar every hour of the day, and basically there are tens of thousands of jobs that are just based in casino, bars, restaurants, music. It's a really good place, but in the global pandemic in which we literally can't be in the same room, it means that tens of thousands of people also can't work. And the most vulnerable people who might have various illnesses, if they get COVID, they will die, or they'll be severely harmed. That means that those people can't go to work. It means that even if the government says you can go to work, they can't go to work to protect themselves. Or if you live with an elder, it means that you can't go to work because you could bring COVID and expose them and harm the elder. Just like everywhere else in the world where everyone else understood this, in Louisiana, they've been like, ooh, we're going to open up eviction court and evict people.
好，那这个是给大家看一下，就是疫情期间的时候，它造成了什么样恶化的情况。其实，在疫情期间，我相信在世界各地，其实大家都体验到的是不同程度的封城，有的是封城1个月，有些地方可能时间更长。那其实整个社会的态度，不管是在亚洲、欧洲还是其他地方，其实社会态度是有点类似，但他们可能也有些不一样。那其实，在路易斯安那呢，因为我们是个非常资本主义的一个城市，所以呢，最后政府就决定说，好，那我们要继续重新在2020年5月，也就是疫情开始真的蛮严峻的时候，就决定说我们要开始重新开放酒吧了。那因为在纽奥良，在路易斯安那，它的整个核心在尤其是纽奥良地区呢，它其实是非常以观光为基本的这个整个经济的发展。 所以呢，如果你到纽奥良地区的话，你基本上24小时都找得到酒喝，你可以每个小时去不同的酒吧。然后我们有好几万人，他的工作其实赖以为生的地方不是赌场，就是酒吧，就是音乐相关的产业或者是餐厅。如果是身为观光客的话，去那边真的是一个非常棒的一个地方。但是呢，因为疫情期间，其实大家照理说是不应该同处一室的。那照理说也因此很多人没有办法工作。那对于这些非常可能相对来说是比较脆弱的人，也就是说，如果他染上了 COVID 的话呢，他可能就会死亡的话，那他因此呢会受到最大的一些影响。因为他们可能就没有办法真的去上班了。就算政府说没关系啊，可以去上班啊，大家就照常上班啊，那酒吧这些东西都可以照常开放。可是他们为了保护自己，他们也没有办法去上班，或者是有一些人他们可能是家中是有老人的，那他也没有办法去上班，不然的话他如果感染了 COVID， 传染给家中的老人就不好了。所以其实在全球大家都了解说，因为疫情影响很重，影响很严重，所以我们可能会造成一些很严峻的影响，然后可能大家必须要彼此保护，或者是要就是社会隔离的这个阶段的时候呢，路易斯安那的政府决定说，这个时候是一个重新开启驱逐法院的好时机。
So basically, what happened is that our government wanted to reopen up eviction court, and I wonder if I should just get people to take a guess when, because people around the globe are always shocked about this. Even the U.S. and the American South, people are shocked. The guess when our government decided to reopen up eviction court.
好，那我们让大家猜一下，说就是路易斯安那政府什么时候决定重新开启这个驱逐法院？因为其实全世界对听到这个消息，甚至美国南方的这些地方听到这个消息都还蛮震惊的。所以你觉得大概他什么时候决定重新开放这个法院
2020。
Oh, but what month?
哪个月
May
？5月吗？May 2021。
You need one more guess?
还有没有其他人要猜猜看
？September。
哦，是2021，也是2021吗？Yeah, September or March 2021.
So our government in Louisiana wanted to open eviction court when people weren't working the second week of April 2020. So a month after the whole world went into lockdown, our government wanted to open eviction court. So you'll see in a little bit why we did such a radical protest, but we were able to fight and prevent eviction court from opening back up into July of 2020, which was a miracle, but it ultimately wasn't enough. So we decided to take radical action because we really felt as if people were evicted, that people were going to die. And so to give context with these signs, the one on the end, it says in evictions or people die. That literally means because we're in a global health crisis, people will die. And so this is a still photo of a video we're going to show after we do the translation, where we stopped eviction court from opening one day as a means to do a protest and slow down evictions. I'll talk about the results that came after we did that action. Sorry.
好，那所以刚刚讲到的是全球大概因为封城啊，整个疫情非常严峻的时间，大概是2020年3月的时候。那路易斯安那呢，路易斯安那州呢，在大家没有办法工作的这段时间呢，决定呢1个月后第2个礼拜，也就是2020年的4月的第2周，就重新开启了驱逐法院。所以重新开始，因此呢，也造成说大家就是开始真的上街头抗议啊，我们没有办法工作，没有钱，然后你的驱逐法院这样重新开启，所以。有这样的抗议以后，然后最后大家就觉得说，好，那我们就延到2020年7月再开吧。那这也许有帮助，但是还是不够的啊。所以因为你可以看到左边这边，大家就真的直接像有一个标语就直接写的是终结驱逐，不然的话大家真的会死。所以因为在这样的全球一个危机里面的话，如果还是继续这样让大家没有直接就是驱逐。没有办法有房子住的话，真的会造成非常大的影响。那右边这一张呢图呢，是我们在法院重新开启的时候呢，我们又再做一个更极端，然后更 更极端、更直接的一个行动。那有一个影片可以给大家看一下，让大家看一下。看完以后呢，我会再跟大家讲一下这一次我们就是真的去占领这一个驱逐法院，然后想要让整个驱逐的过程慢下来，这个东西我们最后造成的结果是什么？
And so this video is the day that we did the eviction court shutdown. I can't remember the date, I should know better. It skips my head. In July of 2020, we physically stopped landlords and government officials from entering in our civil district court where evictions happen, as well as our city hall. And so we intentionally shut down all of government that day. And we got people who were willing to be arrested to take different roles to chain ourselves doors, of going after landlords. And so we surrounded the whole civic complex to prevent people from going in. That way, tenants that day, if you could block a landlord from going to court, any tenant who goes in, their case is dismissed. So we will wait.
好，那给大家看一下，就是这一个就是影片，它基本上是我们是这个是一天的一个活动，但我忘记是哪一天了。基本上就是2020年7月的某一天，那我们就整个封锁包括是驱逐法院所在的地方法院跟我们的一个市中心，就是基本上把整个政府全部都把它封起来，这样的话至少房东没有办法进去，那律师也没有办法进去，那甚至有人会自愿被逮捕，那可能把自己呢真的绑在这个这些大门上面，或者是就直接就是挡着这些房东，不让这些房东进入。因为基本上就是，如果你不让房东进入的话，然后在这个案子开的过程中呢，只有租户在那边的话，你这个案子基本上就直接被就这个案子就不会成立。
All right. Yes, July 3rd.
Until August 24th, in alignment with the Federal CARES Act. Since eviction proceedings resumed on June 29th, 2020, you have done nothing to protect your constituents from becoming houseless. What have they done? What have they done? What have they done? We are on the precipice of a massive housing and homelessness crisis that greatly endangers the lives of New Orleanians and will disproportionately impact Black residents. They indeed have the power to stop evictions in the middle of a deadly pandemic during the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. What have they done? What have they done?
Mayor Cantrell is not only allowing evictions to continue, she's putting policymakers in place to ensure the permanent displacement of Black residents from our city.
Housing advocates have estimated that the need for rental assistance to prevent eviction and houselessness across Louisiana ranges from at least $250 million to as high as $500 million. You, Governor Edwards, instead created an emergency rental assistance program with $24 million. What have you done? Nothing.
Evictions are violent. The people won't be silent.
So that video was created to basically, one, amplify the message of stopping evictions. And what it did do is it led to a slowdown on the number of evictions processed. The judges claimed they were interested in public health. Meanwhile, in July that month, when evictions started up again, they were allowing people to come in the courtroom unmasked. There weren't barriers protecting tenants. And some of our judges are very older, so it was kind of this very like Trump-like thinking that the disease won't get you. And so after we did this eviction court action, they slowed down the number of evictions, claiming that it was because of public health, as well as it led other cities to do that. which then Trump, in being scared of losing the 2020 election, used our Center for Disease Control, our CDC, to basically issue a housing edict saying that any county or parish that had a certain number of COVID cases, working class tenants can be evicted. Everyone knew that Trump did it, but he was able to sort of play both sides by saying that he was protecting tenants while also like saying, no, these people did it on their own. So that then led to our country then increasing rental assistance. And now the Biden administration, the COVID emergency, Act, basically providing protections under COVID, officially ended like 2 weeks ago. And so now the Biden administration is working on a renter bill of rights for the nation. So everything we do as activists in general is always connected, but you can see here how from the very beginning, doing this direct action has an impact on how things occur everywhere. And because in Louisiana, we cannot look to our state government for progressive things, we have to influence the central and federal government. So it's very important that we not only do things because we believe in them and because we have to, but we have to strategize and think how they'll have an impact years later.
那基本上呢，我们这个行动呢，就是刚刚这个制作这个影片，当然也是希望说这个讯息能够传达出去，希望政府能够终结这个驱逐。那当然我们做的行动呢，最后也造成说这整个驱逐这个过程确实也因此慢下来了。那当然法官是宣称说，是因为疫情的关系啊，那我们是为了公共卫生的考量啊，所以我们把这个速度先减缓了。但事实上，当时2020 7月的时候呢，当驱逐法院在开庭的时候呢，所有人其实是不需要戴口罩的，那甚至也没有相关的隔板，然后有很多的法官其实也蛮老的，所以其实他们有点像是有点川普的思维，就觉得说反正疫情我不会染疫啦。所以就是这种概念，但基本上他们后来要减缓这个流程的时候，法官的讲法是说为了公共安全，那我们就先稍微暂缓放慢这个过程。那那时候也刚好在2020年要选举的时候呢，所以川普是非常非常害怕自己会落选，所以呢在那之后，就是他们用他们的 CDC 的那个力量，然后就直接说的是好，他们就有一个住房的这个控管，基本上就是说如果你的相关的城市啊，呢你的疫情的确诊数啊超过了某一个数字的话，那这样的话不能够进行这些工人阶级的人就不能被驱逐出去。那川普做这件事情的时候，当然跟他自己的形象不太合嘛，所以他基本上一方面是说那是他们自己做的，不干我的事；另一方面又其实就是他做的，还是基本上是他落选。那这一个相关的疫情相关的一些规范呢，其实是在2周前的时候呢，就是失效了。所以现在拜登政府呢，基本上他们在草拟的是一个叫做 Renters' Rights Bill， 就是租户权利的这个法案。那基本上可以看到是，其实我们这些行动者他做的这些所有的事情呢，最终可以造成是直接的一些影响。我们知道路易斯安那州的州政府不可能做事，所以我们要做的事情是让我们的行动真的是影响到中央政府、联邦政府。那我们必须要把我们的所有的行动都是要策略化的思考的，去想想它会对未来几年造成什么样的影响。
And so this is just us two present. The photo on the left is just Jane Place's annual members meeting, and then on the right is just an image of us at City Hall. There's posters outside, which you can get once you leave, but us basically fighting against Airbnb from dominating our city. We've done research. You can look at the reports on our website, but showing that upwards to 10% of our housing in the core of our city are occupied by tourists. And so locals don't make as much money. So landlords turning their homes or buildings into housing for tourists has a major impact on people being able to stay in the city. And because New Orleans is surrounded by swamps, once you're evicted from the core of New Orleans, you're displaced over 30 kilometers away, basically. So that's that image. We conduct an annual members meeting every June, in which we talk about issues. And That's us there sweaty in very hot June weather in New Orleans. Yeah.
好，那基本上左边这个呢，就是 Jam Place 我们的年度的会议。右边这个你可以看到它举起的海报呢，其实在报道桌上也有提供给各位，所以如果大家有兴趣的话呢，离开的时候可以拿一张。那基本上就是在抗议 Airbnb 已经完全占领了的纽奥良城市。那如果大家有兴趣的话，如果去上我们的网站，就可以看到的是，其实有报告显示说，其实在市中心纽奥良市中心呢，有大概10%的住房呢，其实都是由观光客占据的。因为当地人其实没有那么有钱，那这些房东呢就会把自己的房子啊，甚至大楼改建，提供给观光客居住。那这其实会非常大的影响到住在这些城市的人，让这些当地工作的人反而没有办法留在市中心。因为我们都知道是，其实纽奥良外围呢，其实是沼泽是没有办法住的，所以基本上如果你没有办法住到市中心的话呢，你就要被迫住到30公里以外的地方。
So we're going to show another video, but just to set it up really quickly, we have a bunch of horrible, objectively terrible landlords in New Orleans due to our state not having strict standards around repairing housing. Tenants can be left in conditions that are really bad for them. And what happens generally is after we have natural disasters, similar to typhoons that have hit indigenous and aboriginal people here, we have situations in which we have hurricanes that hit working class, primarily Black, Latino, and Vietnamese renters, and other working class renters of other backgrounds. And when hurricanes hit the poorest of our renters, they're generally living in buildings where the landlord has delayed maintenance. And so if you combine a hurricane or typhoon against a building where the landlord has to fix a roof, it means the roof caves in. And so this is a story about tenants who came together and organized. I'll talk about the results about what they won after the video.
好，那其实在，纽奥良这个地区呢，其实有非常多蛮糟糕的这些饿死的房东。那在各个面向都很糟糕，因为主要是因为路易斯安那这个地方其实并没有非常严格的一些就是住房的标准啊，或者修缮的一些标准，也就是因此会造成是，譬如说很多天然的灾害发生之后呢，譬如说像台湾可能一些台风呢，它可能冲击的是这些原住民的居住的这些地区，造成了非常大的影响。飓风也是如此。飓风它冲击了美国这些地区呢，它主要影响到的是工人阶级，或者主要的是黑人、拉丁裔或者是越南的这些住户。那他们其实相对来说就是住在这样的一个房东里面，这样的一个大楼里面，但是房东却不愿意去进行修缮，他们的大楼被飓风造成，譬如说屋顶可能垮了或者是漏水了，但是房东呢却更恶意的去延后，就是修缮，就造成了非常大的影响。那等一下我给大家看到这些这个大楼的住户呢，大家组织起来一起采取行动，那等一下也会跟大家介绍说它造成的影响是什么。
So let's go.
Storm after storm, and we consistently get no help. Some landlord, he don't want to help nobody. So he said, who dogs is that out there? No one never answered. So he pulled out his gun. He said, if I kill him right now, y'all will say something. We're human. He don't have no kind of respect for anyone. No maintenance, no plumbing, no nothing. If it rains, the rain sits there for 3 weeks. You can't even come out the door. I lost a brother, not only because of these conditions back here, but they played a part. That's when he got really sick with the mold. My son likes to get around and move around and he can't do that now. You know, after I don't know what happened. Look, I mean, like, wow. The water that comes through the walls. Speaking for everybody else, man, it's a lot of stress. That's the only reason I think people are still here, because you can't find nowhere to go.
So that video was of the Oakmont complex, which EGS saw, and it was pretty horrible by anywhere on this planet's standards. But our city government was comfortable allowing people to live in despair and filth And it wasn't until the tenants reached out to Jane Place and the Renters Strike Assembly and said, we want to organize this association and we want to hold our landlord accountable, that anything changed with the city.
那这个地方，这个影片呢，基本上大家是住在 Oakmont Complex 这个地方，那你可以看到是用世界地球上任何一个地方的标准来看的话，它都是个非常糟糕的居住环境。但是市政府却让这些租户能够被迫继续住在这个非常糟糕、非常恶劣的环境里面。后来是这些租户呢，最后去联络上 Jane Place 还有租户大会，告诉他们说他们也想要组织一个协会。最后因为组织这个协会以后呢，才真的迫使了房东要求要做一些改变，让市政府有一些规范。
And basically what the tenants organized, they had 20 demands, one to be relocated, one they wanted a year of rental assistance, they wanted help with moving costs, and they wanted the building to be renovated, gutted, and then they wanted to preserve the affordable housing. And they won all of those things.
那这些租户基本上列出了20大诉求呢，主要包括是他们可能想要被搬到其他的地方，希望能够在其他地方能够居住，然后希望能够有1年的一些相关的一些补助跟协助，希望能够补助他们的搬家费用，希望他们住的这个地方呢能够重新整修，希望能够拥有保存的是这些可负担的住房，基本上他们希望所有东西都能够达成。
And this has happened because of a mix of policy pursuits, having meetings with public officials, with the tenants, doing petitions, letter writing campaigns, phone calling, what we call phone zaps, where we have thousands of people who call city council members. So we did the policy, we did the legal work via complex mix of lawsuits because he was avoiding paying other people. Is we found out information from a little birdie who told us some things about his financial business. So we were able to exploit all these things. But what combines all these things together is organizing. If the tenants weren't united, if they didn't understand that they had to be patient with each other and work with each other, go to the meetings, do the work to call the city council members, connect with other people in their complexes, then none of it would have happened. As a professional NGO worker, my work would have been useless because the city council member, literally of this district, he's also horrible. He literally privately laughed at what we were doing behind our backs. One of his, or just realized the film, but someone said that he laughed at what we were doing. And so when we told the tenants about this, this really drove them to action.
好，那再来是就是这一些一切的行动，其实包括是你需要能够带动政策上面改革，代表是你必须要做很多很多的事情，去跟政府官员去开会，你去组织这些租户，然后去开会，你真的去写请愿书，你去一起串联，然后大家一起写信，然后去进行声援，或者是你打报这些市政府的 City Council 的电话。那他或者是说，我们也让这个房东呢最后是卷入官司，因为我们后来有人告诉我们说呢，他自己的就是他有些钱啊，这些欠款也没有付，所以呢我们也采取了一些行动，所以是把这些所有东西都组织在一起。但是最重要的是一开始的时候，这些租户、这些租客，他们愿意组织起来，他们愿意团结起来，他们愿意真的彼此对自己对彼此有耐心，愿意真的是投入去做这些工作，去参加这些会议，能够去愿意打电话给这些市议员，能够去做出这些的行动。不然的话呢，其实就算是一个专业的 NGO 工作者，他们就算投入其中，其实这些工作都没有用。最重要的重点就是这些租客要先团结起来，要先组织起来。因为虽然他们这个地方的 City Councilor 其实也蛮糟糕的，就是我们意识到有在录影，但是基本上就是他私下有告诉他说，他私下还笑说他们这些行动就是没有效果，但是这些租户还是团结起来了，然后最后他们也做出了改变。
And so I know I talked a lot about Jane Place, the Renters Strike Assembly. You're like, what are all these groups, how they're connected? And just to review again, but also to give more of an illustration about how everything plays out. Jane Place, of course, was founded in 2008. We birthed the New Orleans Renters Strike Assembly. And New Orleans Renters Strike Assembly is semi-autonomous. So Jane Place we provide resources to it.
好，那因为我们一直在跟大家讲 Jam Place 啊，跟租户大会啊等等，然后大家可能会觉得说这些组织的关系到底是什么，所以我们大家稍微回顾一下跟大家的关系。最左边的是 Jam Place，Jam Place 就是2008年的时候成立的。那在那之下呢，2018年的时候呢，Renters Rights Assembly 租户大会呢成立。但是租户大会呢是一个半自主的一个组织，那 Jam Place 呢主要提供他们的是资源上面的协助。
But Jam Place staff organizers, we also seek to create tenant associations and unions in buildings. That way people in buildings who are in relationship to each other have their own autonomy to decide their fate, negotiate with their landlord. In the same way in the labor union, if you work in an office or a building or factory, you negotiate with your boss, but still you work with other unions and other NGOs and other civil society organizations to change things when things are bad.
好，那再来呢？除此之外，其实 Jam Place 也会去协助这个不同大楼的这些租户呢，能够团结起来，去成立租客协会啊，或者是租客的一些联盟等等。那其实主要原因是希望这些租客能够自主，然后真的就大家聚在一起以后，就可以决定说他们自己的命运是如何，然后能够跟房东进行协商。其实就有点像是我们一般的工会一样，就是你在办公室啊，或者是一家公司啊，可能大家会成立工会。那成立工会之后呢，你们就有办法能够去跟你的老板去谈判、去协商。那同时也像工会一样，这些协会呢也可以彼此合作，所以不只是他们1对1的针对自己的房东，他们也可以彼此跟 NGO 合作，跟其他的合作伙伴合作，一起带动改变，让这些东西能够往更好的方向发展。
So Jam Place as NGO does organizing around lots of housing policy issues. We also organize in buildings to create tenant associations, as well as doing tenant education. The New Orleans Renters Rights Assembly organizes all tenants and primarily focuses a lot on education policy work as well. Whereas tenant associations / unions in buildings, they basically organize against their landlord to hold their landlord accountable or property management company accountable. But ultimately, altogether, the goal is to create more housing justice in New Orleans and in Louisiana, and also to empower marginalized people, right? We just don't want to have housing justice in general because it's good, but we want people to feel empowered in all aspects of their identity, whether it be that they are immigrants, whether it be they are youth, whether it be that they are women and the different issues women experience in our society, whether it's because they're Black, Latino, Asian American, indigenous people. We want everyone to feel more power in society because then we know that we'll have more rights. But we focus on housing justice, but ultimately the goal is that the ordinary person and groups collectively should have more power in society. And government power too, so government, economic, and social power.
好，那其实所以 Jam Place 基本上会组织去负责相关的一个住房政策的一些倡议。那当然呢，也会就是进行一些就是租客的一些教育。那再来呢，是我们看到的是就是上面这个纽奥良的这个租户大会。租户大会呢，基本上包含是所有的租客跟租户。那它进行的也是相关的教育啊，跟政策上的倡议。那右边的这个租客协会呢，主要针对的就是一个大楼或者是同一个房东组织起来的，所以他们是希望让这个房东或者这个物业公司呢能够负起责任。那所以基本上呢，一起这整个三角形凑起来呢，希望能够让路易斯安那在纽奥良地区的这些住房的正义呢能够有所实现，能够让这些边缘化的族群呢能够获得能量，能够赋予他们权利。那所以其实最终的目的当然不只是住房的一些议题，而是在他们的生活的各个面向，所有的身份认同上面，不管他们是移民、年轻人、女性、黑人、原住民，希望他们都能够获得自己的权利，能够获得更多的权利。所以，也许我们是从住房开始，但是我们是希望说这些团体、这些一般人都能够，不管是在政府、政治，然后经济跟社会的权利上，都能够更有权利。
So now that you understand, sort of like the 3 different groups that we have doing tenant organizing, housing justice work in Louisiana, what they represent, I'm going to explain what Gene Place offers overall to the Renner's Rights Movement in New Orleans. So outreach and logistical support. So that's literally helping people plan. That's literally helping people with the material resources of flyers, the digital work we do, the communications work we do. So while I come from out of the Renner's Rights Assembly, and while I'm the manager of the Organized Community Engagement Department, I help manage some of the New Orleans Renner's Rights Assembly's social media, email, text, phone calling systems, because it takes a lot of work. And so I have volunteers from the Renner's Rights Assembly who help. And ultimately, it's my dream one day to not do all of this because I have too much work. But in the meanwhile, me being able to do that enables members of Renner's Rights Assembly to think more concretely about the campaigns they want to do. They can have more conversations with people. They can do more outreach in their neighborhood or their buildings.
好，那再来是就是稍微跟大家讲说 ，Gen Place 到底可以整体来说提供租户大会的什么样以及就是整个租户的一个倡议什么样的一个资源呢？基本上我们做的就是去对外联络啊，然后跟相关的一些物流上啊，还有就是整个整体物资上的一些支持。譬如说呢，我们可以帮忙协作进行规划，进行提供一些物资上的一些支持。譬如说，如果有活动的时候呢，我们可以协助去印制相关的传单啊，我们协助进行相关的沟通啊、联络啊。那譬如说，它是隶属于 Gen Place 的嘛，但是它对于租户大会可以提供什么样的帮忙呢？譬如说，他自己就是社区组织的经理，所以他可以提供就是帮忙租户大会，譬如说经营他们的社群媒体啊，一些上面的一些文字啊，或者是负责一些回讯息啊，或者是回 email 等等，这其实是必须要花很多很多的工的。那所以其实很多时候也许可以靠租户大会的志工，但是很多时候他也必须要去投下去来做这件事情。他是希望有一天他可以不用做这件事情，因为这花了非常多的时间，那他也有很多其他的工作要做。那但是至少把这些工作揽下来做了以后呢，租户大会就会有比较多的时间可以真的去想一想，具体来说他们想要做什么样的倡议，具体来说他们想要做什么样的联络。
And so the second major piece we offer to Renner's Rights Assembly and Renner's Rights Movement in New Orleans is education training opportunities. So education around Renner's rights, as well as other housing rights, but also political education, understanding how government works, understanding why government does things, as well as what we call in the US popular education. So using culture, art, music, cuisine, anything about us as human beings related to who we are, the language we speak, and the culture we have. We want to connect that with people's, I can't remember which word, social standards. Basically, we want to connect everything to people's identity, both individually and collectively. So we offer these educations. So for one example of it is we created a comic book, basically demystifying the eviction and process and tenant law in New Orleans and Louisiana. And it's in plain English, both so that people who aren't highly educated and don't know all the nuance of law, but also for immigrants to be able to access information. And from out of that, we also create a comic book in Spanish, talking about housing rights. And we're working on one in Vietnamese and Haitian Creole, and then Brazilian Portuguese, which are all languages that are in our region.
好，那再来是除此之外呢，我们也提供的是教育跟培训的一些机会，那包括市区教育、租客的一些权利啊、住房的一些权利啊，同时还有一些政治上的一些教育，也就是告诉大家说政府是怎么样进行运作的，所以为什么要怎么做，然后要怎么做才会有效。同时还有一些大众文化一些教育，简单来说就是我们身为人，我们是谁，我们讲的语言、我们的文化、我们的艺术啊，这些吃的东西啊、美食啊、音乐啊等等这一些。连接到不管是我们个人还是集体身份的一个的这些相关的教育跟连接， 所以基本上他们做的事情，譬如说就是有这个刚刚给大家看到一个漫画书，这个做出来这个漫画书呢，基本上就是让大家能够去迷思化说，到底租客的权利是什么，驱逐的一些流程是什么，相关的住房保障跟相关的一些法律的规定到底是什么，所以他们是用白话的英文呢去非常简单的解释，所以就算你没有受过高等教育，就算你可能不清楚这些法律上的细节，你都可以看着这个漫画书就可以知道说我自己的权利在哪里。那甚至也有提供移民也可以看得懂，比如说目前呢在住房权利上面就有提供一个西班牙文版本的，那目前在制作的是想要做成的是越南文版本跟Creole文版本，还有是巴西葡萄牙文版本。
And so these are some of our student members. This is us canvassing door to door, except for Alex. Alex is a musician, so New Orleans has a lot of musicians, so we like to do outreach to musicians and other artists because they're a huge segment of the population. But we're just going door to door in the neighborhood where our office is, basically talking to people about renters' rights and asking them about what type of situations they're experiencing our landlords. And then this is a couple of our student members handing out the eviction comic books to individuals. And there's a couple copies I put on the desk if you want to take a copy home. I suppose you can look on our website more. Thank you. But yeah, I just wanted to explain that and show that. So,
好，那再来给大家看到这2张照片，左边这个呢，基本上就是我们的一些学生的一些会员呢，基本上就是我们在办公室的附近那边呢，我们其实真的会是一个一个敲门去访问，去拜访这些住户的附近的住户，去了解说，他们的状况是如何，然后同时也让他们知道说他们的这个租客这些他们的权利是如何。那刚好这边刚刚介绍有一个是艺术家，音乐家，因为基本上在纽奥良地区有非常多人都是音乐家或艺术家。那再来是就是右边呢，就是也是一样是学生的会员区，跟大家就是发送这个我们刚刚给大家看到这个驱逐的这个漫画书，让大家知道他们的权利是如何。
And so, really quickly, we also offer resources and material support. So we help fund the meeting space of the Renters' Rights Assembly meets at. We coordinate the pro bono, the free lawyers that meets with tenants at Renters' Rights Assembly meetings, as well as we have a separate program where throughout the city we have lawyers and people who meet with people. And then I myself and my coworker Daiquiri and Crush, they meet with people as well. And so we also provide food because in Louisiana we love to eat. And we have some good food. And so we also provide just funding for that as well as help people throw parties because social engagement is at the core of organizing. Meeting people, eating food, having beverages with them, experiencing culture and getting to know them is the most important thing we can do. So we help provide that with the Renters' Rights Assembly.
好，那再来我们也有提供相关的资源啊，跟物质上的一些支持，譬如说我们会安排一些会议啊，组织一些会议，那是甚至在这些会议想要鼓励这些所有人来参加的会议里面，我们有提供义务律师，那就是免费提供他们相关的一些法律的咨询。那同时我们也会真的是在纽奥良这个各个不同的地方呢，去真的是1对1的去面对这些有需要帮助的人。他 Frank 跟 Daiquiri 他的同事呢，也会真的去跟这些有需要的人呢，真的是去碰面。那同时我们也会提供食物，因为在纽奥良地区大家都很爱吃，那那边的食物也很美味，所以它也是连接人的一个方式。那也会协助办派对啊，因为社交的这种场合其实就是最好的一个组织的方式，大家透过吃吃喝喝的方式，能够彼此互相分享文化，同时也彼此互相了解。
And then I want to say that. Oh wait, no, this is a different slide. Oh, you changed the slide. Put it in there. Okay. So really quickly before we get to the second last slide. So just to give the context of the organizing, someone asked me, what is the order of operations of organizing? And I think this is applicable worldwide. Honestly, it doesn't matter what culture you're in on the planet. But we believe first you have to get training in organizing. So understanding strategy, political and social strategy for how you change policy from being in a room like this to thinking public officials who do what you want. One-on-ones, meaning how do you have a conversation one-on-one with someone, go like, hey, what are your interests? What are your passions? Why do you think we need to change things? To then get them to get more deeper involved. And then of course, relationship building, like I mentioned around food and beverages. How do we build culture? How do we build connections to people? In the US, this is very important because we are a very diverse country. And so, we could have a meeting where there could be people whose home language, we could have 5 different home languages. Even if people are all speaking English, their first language can be different. And so sometimes the one way we build connections and build trust so there's no misunderstandings is by having fun. Should I go through all and then if you want to go? Okay. And then second, finding opportunities to engage people and directly impact the individuals. So going out into the community, going to the most marginalized and vulnerable of individuals and families and homes to find people who are most impacted, who need to be a part of the organizing. So at home, in public, we canvass a lot at bus stops where we talk to people about what's going on. Sometimes we go into the tourist area in the French Quarter in New Orleans, and we'll go to bar and just talk with bartenders about their lives. And then create events designed to connect with people. So almost sort of like a bee going at a flower. How do you attract the bee to you? That's a very important thing. And then as I mentioned above, one-on-ones. So the way that people really get involved in organizing and the way that people who are ordinary, directly impacted people take leadership is all intentionality. Some people are like firecrackers. Like you light them on fire and then they just go psh, and they're like superstars. They're the ones who knock all the doors to their neighbors and get them involved. But a lot of the leaders you see, regardless of where you're at in the world, it's because they had a conversation with someone. It's because they learned about something. So the one-on-ones are very important, and then the meetings where people decide things together is important. And then the organizing, we have what we call a direct ask, right? It's one thing to meet with people, but we've all been in meetings that are boring and we don't know why we're in the meeting. Someone's just having a meeting for the sake of the meeting. But we can give someone direct ask, hey, I want you to do this. Can you speak at this meeting with this city council member? Can you fly your neighborhood? We give intentionality to the work that we're asking people to be involved with. And then leadership building. So training people, intentional leadership training. So you may have someone, for example, who goes like, I just don't understand why we're doing this. And so that takes training to get people to understand why they're doing what they're doing.
好，那因为之前的场合有人问过说，到底我们要怎么样组织的整个顺序大概是如何，所以我们基本上就把它列出了大概是5大顺序。那从一开始的培训、组织的策略，到找到机会互动、1对1跟会议，还有直接询问，以及这些领导的这个整个领导力的一个培养。那基本上从第一个开始来讲的话，就是非常简单，就是我们先从培训跟组织的策略去我们来看起。第一个要第一个看到说我们要去找到时间，真的去跟这些人去互动。你在跟大家1对1面对面的时候，其实尤其是美国是一个非常多元的一个地方。你去建立关系的时候呢，你可能在一场会议里面，你会发现说这些人来自很多不同的背景，他们的母语可能都不一样，可能一个场合里面就有大概说了5种不同母语的人。那也许他们都会说英文，但是我们要找到的是一个共通点。就像刚刚提到的是，譬如说食物啊，跟这些就是真的让大家享受一下，放松一下，这种时候呢，会是很好的一个联系呢，建立关系的方式。那然后再来是说，就是你要真的去直接的互动，找到这些真的是备受影响的人，这些边缘化的人，你去找到他们，让他们真的愿意组织起来，让他们真的愿意参加这些活动。那他们常常去的地方呢，就是譬如说公车站。那或者是说，就是他们的那个观光区，就是 French Quarter 他们的法国区。那或者是真的是走进酒吧里面，然后跟里面的这个调酒师啊、酒保这边去谈一谈、聊一聊。那真的就有点像是蜜蜂找到花一样，就是让这些蜜蜂知道说这个花在哪里，真的去吸引这些蜜蜂过来聚集在这一块。然后再来呢，进入到的是1对1跟会议。1对1是非常重要的，其实就是有些人其实就像是烟火。 你一点个火以后呢，他们就真的可以非常灿烂的就这样烧起来，那就像真的变成是这样超级巨星一样。但有些人呢，他们之所以愿意投入的原因呢，是因为你真的可能是因为他跟你的一场对话，你真的是让他去了解这件事情，然后真的是有一些互动，才会开始就是激发起他愿意投入、愿意参加、愿意组织的心。那再来是会议也非常的重要。那第4点呢是直接去开口，真的去询问，因为有时候我们开了各种各样的会议跟这种聚会，但是很多时候大家都不知道说会议开会的原因到底是什么，有时候好像是为了开会而开会，所以在这个时候直接开口就非常重要，就是请他来帮你做某一件事情，让他真的有一种我真的投入是有原因的，那我的参与是有价值的。譬如说，你可不可以去跟这一个政府官员谈一谈，或者是你可不可以去联络你的邻居去做某一件事情，让他真的去参与这样的一个过程，进入到这一个组织的核心。最后一个呢，就是领导力的一个建立，就是有些人也许不知道自己为什么要做什么事情，为什么要做这件事情，为什么要有所投入，但是透过培训，其实基本上能够慢慢的打造出来这样的一个整个社区的领导，最后让这个人能够领导这一个组织。
Oh, and I clearly forgot to mention why I have the random image of an older man with a kid, and they're fishing. And so the analogy about organizing is that to get people involved is like fishing. You may try 20 times, and you might get one small fish, and you just have to keep going. And so organizing, I will say, is the most frustrating work I've ever done, more so than research, more so than policy work, more so than studying calculus when I was younger. Organizing is honestly the most up and down job you can do, whether you're a participant in an organization or you're a paid professional organizer like myself. But if you understand it, it's like fishing, that will keep you going forward. You're gonna have a lot of disappointment, more disappointment than success. And I had the elder once tell me that, and that is what has kept me going forward, when I've been depressed in my organizing.
好，那其实基本上我刚忘了讲一下，这个左边这张图的一个譬喻，为什么我要选用这张图？基本上就是组织这个事情呢，对我来说有点像是钓鱼，你可能要试20次，然后最后只钓到一条小鱼，但是没有关系，就是一直在试，一直在试。组织这件事情其实是非常让人沮丧的一件事情，它比研究还难，比政策倡议还难，甚至比我大学的时候念微积分还要困难。它是非常困难、非常让人沮丧的一件事情，你绝对会是失败远大于成功。但是你继续这样做，基本上就会有成就。那基本上也是我一开始投入的时候有人告诉我的。
And so lastly, in our organizing work, it takes a team. And you may see someone who's very familiar here, but I just want to introduce some of my coworkers because in order for us to do this work, it takes a lot. So this is Sarah, our land trust property member, who actually was a tenant of ours, and now she runs a lot of our property, and she also helps tenants out when they're facing issues. This is Kim, aka Crush is Kim's nickname, and they do a lot of our work with immigrants of all backgrounds, in particular Haitians, but also mainly Latinos, as well as she does a lot of work with youth because she is only 22, or they are only 22. This is Thackeray, who used to be on our board. You may remember me earlier talking about his sister who designed the logo of the Runner Strike Assembly. This is me, of course. This is Russell, who does a lot of our advocacy research. He's hiding. Everyone knows Ichia, who was a fellow with us and brought many gifts to us. This is Trisha, who does our eviction court monitoring project, which is a really amazing program, and I just realized I totally did not talk about that. But if you're interested, feel free to message me. I can talk to you more about it, because it's pretty unique, not just in the context of the United States, but really in the globe, in the way that people can monitor evictions. And this is our executive director, Veronica, who's very, very strict, but very fun as well, but mainly just strict. And she's the one who keeps all the glue together. And then wait, isn't it? And then there's another person joining us who's an accountant, but he doesn't really do organizing, so he's not here. But yeah, so I just want to say it takes a lot of people, to just get one person to a meeting. So all of us work together to make it all happen.
好，那其实最后也只是给大家看一下，说我们整个团队基本上就是要靠整个团队的力量才能够让这一切是有可能的，甚至让一个人能够参加会议。所以这边介绍一下，左上角这边是 Sarah， 她是负责主要是土地信托的相关的一些物业的管理。那她自己也是她在我们这个土地信托的这个其中一个租客。那目前也会负责的是去协助其他的租客，如果碰到问题的时候协助解决。在下面这一位呢是 King， 他主要负责的是移民相关的问题，主要面对的是很多各式各样不同背景的，但很多都是拉丁裔以及年轻人。那因为他们都还蛮年轻的，他们都才22岁。然后再来是 Zachary， 大家可能记得是他的姐姐，基本上就是刚刚帮忙负责我们那个 logo 的设计我们 logo 的那个人。然后在右位躲在里面那一位呢是 Russell， 然后以及大家都知道前面这一位一开始后来中间加入我们的 fellow 宜家，那他带了很多的礼物给我们。然后再来是最前面那一位呢是 Trisha， 她负责的是我刚刚完全没有特别提到的，就是整个驱逐法院的整个监督的过程。那如果大家有兴趣的话，我们之后也可以再谈谈，其实整个驱逐的这个流程的这个监督也是非常重要的。在最右边呢，就是我们的执行长。那他基本上呢，就负责，他是一个非常严格，但是非常有趣的人，但主要是以严格为主。那但是也因为他，所以他能够把我们整个团队，把所有人全部连接在一起。所以就像刚刚跟大家讲的是，这是一个团队，那基本上真的是要靠一个整个团队的力量，才能够真的去协助带动持续的组织。
And then questions, if you would like to stay in If you would like to stay in contact, this is my email. And you can also reach out to me WhatsApp, also online too, as well. And this is me with a cat I found in the neighborhood once.
好，那
Kitten.
那看看大家有没有任何的问题呢？如果大家想保持联系的话，这是他的联络方式，包括他的 email， 还有他的 WhatsApp。然后他现在也有 Line 也是一样的。那这一张呢是他跟他在附近，就是家里附近找到的一只猫。
Thank you, everyone.
谢谢大家。
就是让我做一点小结，然后趁这个时候让大家整理一下思绪，就是准备问题这样。那就是很感谢 Frank 跟泰和，就是在刚刚的1个小时里面，就是谈从纽奥良的这个历史的特殊性嘛，然后谈了 Dream Place 是怎么来的。那过去5年他们主要的倡议的工作是在什么地方，有什么样的进展？那作为工作人员呢，就是怎么样跟租户大会合作？那其实我觉得在这些故事当中，其实最重要的那个讯息对我来说是，这件事情要能成功，其实是很需要草根的力量。可是草根的力量又从何而来呢？其实是又从这个很基础的组织工作而来，即便它可能比听起来比微积分还要难。那最后也补充说，他们在做组织工作的时候，比较常进行的一些流程。那因为时间的关系，就是可不可以请就是想要问问题的人都先举手这样，然后再来决定说我们要分成几个段落进行这个 Q&A。好，那就请大家举手吧。1、2，还有吗？还有吗？3、4、5。好，那等一下还要再问也可以。那我们这一轮的话，先，好不好 ？If you take five minutes question, then I'm not sure do you want to.
No, that's perfect.
好，那我们一次就是把这一轮有举手的人就全部都收集完。好。
Oh, no, one at a time.
One at a time. OK.
Sorry.
待会会帮人家翻译，
因为
一次2个。
一次2个。
Okay.
好，那大家手举高一点。好，那我从后面的开始。
My name is Patty, and I'm a little curious about the social house, how it looks like, how poor it is, or how old, or how small. I'd like to. Could you share more about information about the social house?
Oh, you wanted to.
好，那第一个问题是在问社会住宅，它在纽奥良大概是什么样的样貌？就是它的是比较旧，还会比较小呢？它大概长的这个状况是如何？
City or Owen?
那个像 想请教一下，就是刚刚有提到社会住宅政府是拆除，那我不懂为什么政府要去拆它，是因为要把它改建成更好的吗？或者是用什么原因？然后因为是在灾后，所以灾后应该是做很多重建，而不是做拆除这样子。然后第二个是就是纽奥良刚刚有提到有很多私人地产商在灾后去进驻，那是不是用一个公司合伙，然后做事实上是开发的概念这样子。然后第三个比较实际是说，因为有很多的住宅，然后很多的那我可以只问第三个，就是有很多的大楼，你们要怎么样去选择你们要组织哪一个大楼这样子？会不会选择这个比较好组织，你们去组织这样子？我的论文是写那个我是看过好。
So regarding social housing, so yeah, we have 20 units spread in 11 buildings. We're currently, as I'm here in Taiwan, acquiring another building. Don't know where it is, but it's currently right around our other buildings. And we have 80% of the units occupied. And so there are a range of 3 bedrooms, and then there are 2 bedrooms. Ultimately, what we know from the market is that the biggest demographic after single mothers with children who need housing are middle-aged workers to elderly, so 40 years old to 70. And so we are trying to develop more studio and 1-bedroom apartments to meet that demand. But yeah, so some of our units are in an apartment complex where there's 5 units, and then some are in houses where there's 2 units.
That's the social housing that you want.
Yes.
那他们拥有的社会住宅呢，基本上大概是20个单位，然后总共是有11个大楼，基本上，不好意思，80%的住房的状况呢，大概是3房到2房左右。那因为我们发现说，其实主要住在那边的人呢，要不就是单亲的母亲，然后带着小孩，或者是中年到老年的这些工人阶级，所以可能是40到70岁左右的。所以基本上我们也希望能够打造出更多是有点类似工作室那种一房需求的这种住房。那这样有些呢是可能是，譬如说如果是公寓的话，可能有5户；那可能有一些是一般的房子的话，可能是2户左右。
Oh, also important thing that I forgot to mention, we physically own the land and the building. And there's a long history about social housing in the US. I can explain why the government gives an NGO money to own the land and own the house. But ultimately we own it, and so that's a big difference in Taiwan in that regard.
好，那另外一个跟台湾很大的不同就是由他们来持有土地跟跟这个房子的，也就是说，其实在美国的状况是说，就是有很大的历史脉络跟原因，就是为什么这个整个社会的住宅呢，其实是政府给钱给 NGO 让他们去持有这个土地跟住房，但基本上这在跟台湾是很大的不同。
Regarding why did the government want to tear down the social housing, even though it was well built? It's social engineering. They want to get rid of poor people in New Orleans. And so it's a long US policy going back to the early 90s to the first George W. Bush presidency. But basically all social housing in the US owned by the government that was developed from the 1930s into the 80s has been converted to mixed income housing. We say publicly, we say to everyone, we believe it's social engineering to get rid of first poor people, working class people, but also to deconcentrate the number of Black, Latino, and poor working class Asian Americans who are in American cities, which most social housing owned by the government is in the core of the city. And so we see it as basically social engineering by very conservative individuals.
那再来是刚刚有提问到说为什么要去拆除这一些社会住宅，基本上我们认为它是一个社会的工程，基本上就是希望能够驱逐纽奥良地区这些穷人。那它算是1990年代初期的时候就开始有一个政府的政策，从一开始布希总统他上任的时候呢，基本上就开始在做的这件事情，就是1930年代到80年代的时候呢，开始政府盖了一些社会的住宅。那在1990年代初期，布希总统上任之后呢，他就开始将这一些30年代到80年代做的盖的这些社会住宅呢，慢慢转换成是混合收入的住宅。那我们认为，我们也公开这样讲，就是我们认为它是一个社会工程的一个方式，就是希望能够驱逐在纽奥良地区，一开始想要驱逐的是这些工人阶级的这些人，这些穷人。那但是其实也是希望透过这样的一个方式，能够让拉丁裔啊、黑人啊、一些相对比较穷的人啊、亚裔啊等等这些移民的人呢，人数能够减少。那至少因为这些社会住宅主要都是盖在市中心，那至少让市中心这些人口的这些数量减少。
Regarding which buildings to organize, if tenants reach out directly, then we pursue that relationship and we examine what are the factors that can make it much more easier to win and organize people in the building. And so those could be anything from maybe the landowner took money from city government, maybe there's cultural value to the building, and so therefore people feel more as though the building belongs to them. Generally, we look for a diversity of people in the building, because generally we find that when we can bring people together, because the differences sounds counterintuitive, but when we can bring people together due to differences, they're much more likely to be curious about each other in the building, if it makes sense. So there's a range of factors, but definitely examine the landlord's finances to figure out if they take any money from the government, because we can exploit that really well.
好，那至于是要看说到底我们基本上要决定是组织哪一栋大楼的租客的话，就主要是第一个是看租客有没有主动来找我们说希望他们能够组织起来。那如果有找我们的话，我们就会去检视一下这栋大楼这些租客大概的状况，有几个一些要素跟因素，看看说是不是比较容易能够获胜。譬如说第一个是房东他基本上是不是有收到政府的一些钱或是政府的补助，然后再来是这栋大楼是不是有一些相关的一些文化的价值。让周遭的人是觉得说，就好像是我们拥有这一块大楼一样。那再来是这里面租客人是不是来自多元的一个背景？那这听起来可能有点反直觉，但基本上是，如果你能够把这么多不同背景的人全部都聚在一起，让他们一起努力的话，通常他们都会彼此更好奇，能够彼此更照顾。那再来是，当然一定会看的就是这个刚刚讲到的是房东的这个财务状况，就是到底有没有跟政府拿钱等等这些。
Next question.
大家好，我是那个奥尔斯工作人员琼慧。刚刚讲者在这个简报里面有提到说，这个飓风过后，纽奥良遭遇了这个房屋状况非常的不好。那公部门呢不愿意介入处理这个屋况很差，甚至要驱逐这些房客那在那个讲者里面有提到说，他们怎么样的组织房客来阻止这个驱逐法院相关的执行活动。可是呢，他有提到说，因为 Jane Place 的介入，让这个房东愿意出钱给房客搬迁了，甚至呢，这个房东愿意帮忙找新的房屋居住。这个部分能不能请他多阐述一些？就是在政府部门不愿意介入的情况底下，Jane Place 的介入让这个事情可以发生，然后让这个弱势的房客得到新的居住，而且获得了搬迁费用。谢谢。
我的问大家好，我是小鱼，然后我想要问的问题是，因为刚刚我讲有很多，就是 Jane Place 有协助很多就是 union 去 成立嘛。那想问说，最小的一个据点的话，就是会是多少人？然后就是所以这样而且不同规模的，就是这些单位的，就是参与进大会驻大会里头，那他们之间的关系会是一个水平的参与吗？还是会想办法再更阶层化的？然后第二个问题是说，因为这些租户是在不同大楼，甚至是不同房东的情况下，那会有出现说，就是大家觉得我们的问题是一个个别的问题，而不是一个集体的问题。我想问的是说，因为在台湾的经验是每个租户都是面对一个个别单一的房东，那他们想象自己要共同行动比较困难。那我有点好奇，就是在美国怎么这方面？
So the first question, so basically we organize tenants to think of different strategies and tactics, I forgot to mention tactics, but different tactics to put pressure on city government to intervene. And then we also did that with the bank to give the landlord the money to buy the apartment building. And then we found out that the landlord, Josh Brunel, wasn't paying the bank correctly. And so we exploited that situation by pushing the bank, which is a federal bank, Fannie Mae, to put pressure on Josh Brunel. So basically that pressure led them to file bankruptcy, which ultimately we wanted to take the property out of his control. And so that's one of the things the tenants wanted, and recently, a month ago, that happened. And so now the new landlords who bought all the buildings are agreeing to a set of protections to their tenants, as well as keeping the rent affordable. But basically it's just examining what type of tactic will get this person to do something, that person to do something, and you just work with tenants to think about that on an individual level. It may be 20 tactics you have to use, or maybe 30. So I hope that answered the question.
好，那第一个是说，就是怎么样去真的让就是房东真的有所动作。那以租客来讲的话呢，基本上你是要跟着租客一起去想，然后想出不同的策略，或者是我刚刚没有提到的是战略，不同的方式去施压市政府，让政府或者是银行，所以是施压政府跟施压银行，施压不同的利害关系人。因为银行是出钱给这些房东的嘛，那所以，比如说以这个房东来讲的话，就是刚刚有一个非常糟糕的那个二子房东 Josh Bruno， 我们后来发现说他没有准时在帮银行，没有在准时还钱，所以我们就是在去施压银行，然后刚好他又是个联邦政府银行 Fannie Mae， 所以这个银行基本上呢就也可以对这个房东进行施压。那我们后来有觉得说他真的就是反正管理得很糟糕，所以我们也希望说干脆换人管好了。那最后真的也成功了，所以在1个月前呢，其实他的这个房产他就不再是他所持有了，后来就有一个新的房东入住，那这个房东也承诺说会给租客相关的一些保障，而且保证说这个租金是可以负担的。所以基本上就是真的去想各个不同的战略，哪一个战略对这个人有用，哪一个战略对那个人有用，每一个不同的人他们可能要针对的是不同的战略，然后一起坐下来好好的跟租客一起去思考，可能需要20个战略，可能需要30种不同的战略。
The question about the tenant association is really good, and this point I didn't mention. We primarily work in big buildings because due to the way that, in particular, American capital, I mean, I think this is everywhere, but the way American capitalism operates is that people tend to want to buy bigger buildings with lots of apartments and then put in as little work repairing them. That way they generate a huge profit. And so the smallest building currently we're working in is the Bell School, which is a social housing building. And that building has about 30 units of housing. And it's primarily older musicians and artists and people who are involved in the civil rights movement. But generally most of the buildings in which we're organizing in tend to be 100 to 200 units. And then you want me to do that? Okay. And so collect this situation. One of the reasons why we created the New Orleans Renters Strike Assembly, as much as I talk about organizing apartment buildings, most tenants in New Orleans are kind of similar situations in what I've learned in Taipei, and then they live in single structures. They live in houses. And so organized tenant unions and associations are important because the worst landlords objectively they own big apartment buildings, but we also want to create a space for a tenant who is concerned about their rights, or maybe they just want to be a part of a political group or social group that's fighting for more rights. And so you don't need to have other neighbors to be involved in the Renters Strike Assembly. You can be homeless and be in the Renters Strike Assembly. You can live in a big complex, or you can live in a house. You can live with someone who owns their house in the bedroom in their home and be part of this. So I think this concept is very important for moving government policy. Like, doing organizing around government policy, because, if you're trying to organize a tenant who lives in an apartment building next to their landlord, it's not gonna work because it's just them and the landlord right there. But if you provide political space where everyone can plug into, then that will ultimately help to shift society by focusing on laws and ideals that can be moved at the municipality, state, and federal level, if that makes sense.
好，那基本上刚刚那个租客协会的这个问题非常的好，但基本上我们主要是要组织的都是比较大型的这种大楼的里面，所以以美国资本主义的概念来讲的话，当然这些人会希望能够买下这种越大型的这种大楼啊，公寓越好，然后做最少的这些修复的工作，然后这样的话就可以赚很多钱嘛。那所以基本上我们目前的租客协会最小的单位大概是一个社会住宅的Bellsco那边的社会住宅，基本上是30个单位。那里面住的主要是一些比较年长的艺术家、音乐人啊，或者是参与过公民权的这个抗争的这些人。那其他的这些租客协会大概主要的单位大概都会有100到200个单位。那以集体来说的话，租客权利它就是一个集体的一个权利的一个争取。那基本上大多数纽奥良地区可能跟台北大家可能不太一样，就是大家主要是住在这种单一的这种1层、2层这种房子里面。那比较大型的这种建筑，这种大楼是比较少的。那但是我觉得不管是住在哪些地方的人呢，其实租客都可能会担心他们自己权利的受损。那他们也希望能够隶属于某种政治团体或是某种社会的团体，能够一起参加。所以不管你的居住状况是如何，你就算没有邻居，你是住在房子里面，你是住在一个大房子里面，或者是你无家可归，你是无家者，然后你可能住在，或者是你是住在比较大型的这种大楼啊的里面。其实，或者是你是跟别人一起有室友的一起共享的，其实基本上这些人都可以参加租客大会，那一起去真的去做一些政治上的一些倡议，想要改变法律跟政府跟想法跟政策。因为有时候如果你想要组织一个，比如说有一个租客，他旁边就住他的房东，然后你希望他能够参与组织，然后带动一些改变捍卫自己的权利，不可能嘛，因为他的房东就在旁边嘛，他不敢单一的去做这件事情。可是如果你把它带到一个政治的空间里面，真的去改变这整个社会，然后真的去推动立法上或者是政策上的改变，从市政府层级、州政府层级到联邦政府层级的话，这样的话会带来是比较大的一些变革。
If you have any more questions, feel free to send me an email, and I will get my friends in the USA to translate it.
好，如果大家有任何问题的话呢，都可以继续寄 email 给他，他会请他在美国的朋友呢把它翻成中文。
Yes. One more.
这个，最后一个是好，那个还有人有问题吗？最后一轮哦，好，最后了，来哈。OK， 好，那
这位。
Frank， 谢谢你很精彩的演讲。我第一个问题很简短，所以不晓得 Jam Place 这个名字有没有什么特别意义？是不是刚刚讲过我不都听了？然后第二个问题是有关你刚刚在谈到说有关 identity 的部分哈。那在台湾就是组织租客可能会碰到的问题是说，认为租屋只是一个过程短暂的身份，那或者是在一个购房已经有屋者很高的状况之下，然后个别的这个租客会不容易形成集体感，会觉得这是自己的问题。 那我想问一下，在他们的情境里面 ，identity 身份的确立比较常碰到的障碍是什么？
你好，我是春子，然后就是我想要问的问题，是可能跟租的居住品质本身或居住的权益本身并没有关系，但是就是连带的想请问你们有没有就是处理过，跟比方说因为租屋者他的身份，然后遭受到的歧视有关的，就是其他的连带的政策，比方说教育方面的。就是比方说，因为我有2个小孩，然后小孩到要进小学的时候才知道说，台湾就是特别是在台北市，它是租屋家庭比例最高的一个城市，但是它对租屋的小孩，它的就是限制也是最严苛的，就是它要求租屋者必须要上法院公证，然后6年才会承认他住在这个地方。就是这整个问题的核心就是政府不承认穷人住在的房子里面，如果你是买房子的话，他就说我承认你住在这里。然后如果你是租房子的话，就是因为他设的条件太严苛了，以至于不可能满足，所以他就说我不承认你住在这里。那因为就是您刚刚提到，就是说在倡议的那个初期，就是草根性，然后要怎么样去教育，然后连接大家，然后唤起共识，这个很困难。其实我心有戚戚焉，就是因为我上1年多以来，我觉得说。要去找到有同样处境的家长，非常非常的困难，因为它不是直接跟居住有关的。比方说居住的话，大家在台湾就会建议你找崔妈妈或者是ALS房，然后但是它不是居住方面的，然后它也不是教育政策，它是教育的入学这一块的政策，然后就是完全就是针对居住者他居住的空间，因为是租的，而不是自己拥有的，就剩地歧视条款。然后它造成的结果就是说，不好意思，因为我会有一点被翻译干扰，就是我有点同时来就是做2件事情，就是本来住在这里的地方，他因为住在很远的地方的人来寄户口，寄在这个地方，然后就变成外面的人来念这个学校，然后把租房子的小孩子就挤到别的地方去念，他本来可能只要走路5分钟，就变成要走路半个小时这样子。那家长的话，为什么要找到同样困难？就是家长很困难，就是因为，比方说在5月份的时候处理入学分发这个事情，但是他分发一放榜，然后9月就要念了。你去找行政救济的话，就是也缓不济急，可能要2年。所以大家就是在社会就是在倡议的时候，很容易就变成出现事不关己的情况。就是说，一个就是说，我打完行政诉讼可能都2年了，那这件事情就也就算了。第一个就是你跟政府打官司，本来就很难赢，所以再来就是大家就觉得说啊，被挤掉就算了，然后就是很多习得无助感，所以很难找到就是家长去结盟。再来就是说，在这个社会就有我不知道是不是台湾比较容易这样，就是你比较难去启齿说我是一个租房子的人，就是他还是有个阶级存在，然后所以你要去找这样说，对我们都是租房子的，然后我们要去争取出来我们的权益，然后这个行政命令是违宪的，就是很困难这样子。那不知道说可不可以在这方面就是给我一些建议，就是说他明明是很核心，就是对租屋者歧视的这种问题，但是他因为不是跟居住本身相关的，然后是教育政策，所以很难找到结盟的人。那这件事要怎么做？像我在 Facebook 上买广告，然后你可以设定一些过滤条件，然后要找一些就是可能对 law 或者是 education， 或者是说就是在 primary school 的这些小孩子有关，但是就是很难引发人的共鸣这样子，就是因为刚提到你谢谢了，不好意思。
I think I guess my answer for both questions are kind of similar. I think in the US we have this term class consciousness, which is ideal that in the way that people have consciousness of their identity according to their race or ethnicity or their gender or sexual orientation, maybe disabilities they have, that ultimately we also need consciousness according to the socioeconomic status that people occupy. And I think a part of that is examining intersectionality. So while you say it's not completely a housing issue, to me it sounds like there are government structural barriers preventing poor people from obtaining a high-level education. Of course, in the US, we had a major movement in the 50s, 60s around desegregation, in which segregation isn't as bad as it was, obviously, in the 50s, 60s. But even in places in the US where we see high levels of racial integration, we still see class integration or segregation. And so I think it's important to work across different movements to go like, hey, let's work on this together, because there's a range of different things renters are experiencing. So I guess that would be really my piece around the short-term rental piece. You know, and the thing actually exists in the US in terms of how people perceive themselves with the American dream. That people like who are middle class, in particular, even if they're a renter for 50 years, they will go like, I'm gonna buy a house one day, and they could be 70 years old, and still that is the ideal that they have, in part because the security that comes with owning a home. But the question I think that I would ask people in general, or not that I would ask, but I do ask people, is what is wrong with being a renter? Rather than looking to home ownership to have protections, let's change the laws and policies to protect the renters. So I think if people understand themselves in their class, especially when people won't own a home, because if you look globally at home prices, and where on this planet can, you know, young working class, middle class people, even people with degrees afford homes? It's like everywhere on the planet it's expensive. So I think like building this class consciousness, the renting is enough. And you shouldn't have to go into deep debt to have this fictional ideal of what it means to be complete. Then you see changes. So maybe it's not so much organizing that you start off with, but it's community building. It's a political and social education to get people to think of themselves as feeling complete and okay with their identities. The same way that you think about LGBTQ queer liberation, right? It's not the ideal that you need to pretend as though you're straight, but that being gay, being queer is enough. And so I would say same thing with being a renter. It's like, you know, being a renter is enough. And you should still be able to have a good life regardless. I don't know if that.
好，那其实我也许对两位的回答其实都有一点类似，基本上就是其实在美国其实也有这样的类似这种阶级的意识，你会针对不管是你的种族、族裔、性别、性倾向，或者是身体上的不同的障碍，而有一些自觉。那当然你那样子的感觉也会因为你的社经地位而有所的影响，所以这一切来说的话有一个交织性。那其实你刚刚有提到说，这不完全是跟住房有关系，但我觉得是政府创造了一个结构性的一个屏障，让这一些相对来说比较穷的人呢，没有办法获得高等的教育。那基本上就是像是政府在其实美国在50、60年代的时候有另外一波的一个去隔离化。那其实，在50、60年代的时候呢，其实隔离早就没有那么严重了，至少不是种族的隔离，但是是有阶级的隔离的。所以我觉得要做的事情，也许可以做的事情是让不同的运动能够开始一起合作，去建立，因为它是有那个交织性的，所以就让那样子不同的运动去一起做这样的合作。再刚刚回到这个问题是提到说，大家会觉得说租屋只是短期。那其实，在美国也会有这种美国梦，这是一个中产阶级都会有的一个梦。就算他已经租屋40-50年的人，他一定会告诉你说，有一天我就会买房啊。那甚至他已经70岁的时候，他也会告诉你说，我有一天就是会买房啊。对他们来说，他们还是有这个想法跟这个理想，觉得说拥有房子这个东西，这个提供的安全性是他想要的，是美国梦的一个实现。那但是我觉得应该要让大家知道的是成为是租户或者是租客这件事情错在哪里，不好的地方到底在哪里？而不是说我们的法律是保障是这些房屋持有者，可是是不是我们可以做一些改变，变成是它来保障的是我们这些租客跟租户？ 所以变成是大家真的对于自己的目前的状况跟自己的情况是觉得说很自在的，我觉得不买房也是 OK 的。因为在全球，其实世界各地都一样。我们现在房价这么高，哪一个年轻的工作阶级人，哪一个中产阶级人，真的，就算大学毕业有了这个学位以后，谁买得起房？大家都买不起房。所以，也许是不是我们要以自己这个租客这个阶级去理解，说其实这样就够了。我不需要真的是让自己债台高筑，去为了实现一个理想上的一个梦，就觉得说好像我一定要买房、拥有房。我们应该要改变，也就是说，这个也许不是需要一个组织，这也许需要这个社区的教育、政治上、社会上一个相关的一个教育，去理解到说我这个身份我是 OK 的，这个身份我就够了，我本身就是一个完整的存在的。其实就有点像是当初 LGBTQ 的这个解放跟这个运动一样，就是身为我不用假装自己是异性恋，我身为 LGBTQ 其实就够了，所以我身为租客的身份、租户的身份这就够了，我也可以有一个很好的生活。
I hope that was a good answer, but if you have other questions, I have lots of many thoughts about this.
那希望这足够可以回答到大家的问题，但是如果大家有其他问题的话，都可以提问。那其实我也有其他一些想法跟回应。
就是非常再次感谢，就是大家在礼拜六的下午，就是抽空来现在这个很好的空间。然后这个空间是就是 Ours 的办公室，然后如果大家有兴趣的话，就外面还有一些义卖的东西，然后帮他们的文宣品。那在最后的最后呢，我们大家离开之前，我们要一起拍个照，这样子。那我们
哦，学区。好。啊，我忘记。